I knew this would be a place to lay down my roots long before I even knew what this place was. As a teen, I was in something of a spiritual conundrum. I was raised Catholic, but felt increasingly estranged from it. I had always fostered a deep love and reverence for the world's sacred stories and folk tales, and had myself started a kind of private pagan practice. And this doesn't even touch my queerness or my transness. As I approached the move to college, much of my being craved an end to spiritual loneliness. I craved a community where I could bring all of myself and be asked to leave none of it behind. As a teen, I knew very little about Unitarian Universalism. There aren't many UUs in rural Warren County. But what I did know is that it was a tradition where I could just be. I could show up with my paganness to worship and work out my relationship with Catholicism. And along the way, my branches would grow in the light of so many traditions around me. I would soak up the hymns of Peter Mayer, psalms of Mary Oliver, invocations of Marta Valentin, and so many more. This living, growing Unitarian Universalist tradition of ours is one that says to each of us, your experiences in their totality and completeness are worthy and have lessons to teach all of us. At its best, it doesn't ask us to cut off our roots from our branches, grafting us to new rootstocks in an unfamiliar orchard, so that we might belong. It is a sacred grove where our roots, whatever they may be, settle deeper, and our branches rise stronger together. I'm delighted and honored that a few members of our community will share their stories with us, reflecting on the many traditions and influences that have shaped their experiences as Unitarian Universalists. For some of us, these stories may feel familiar, and there are many more experiences that these do not begin to touch. As we gather here this morning, may we reflect on the journeys of the people around us and on our own journeys. May we remember this as the home for all of our roots to grow.
I did not realize that my visits with one Birch Spick here on Sunday mornings would lead to this. Watch out. So what is my 5-minute message? It begins with saying that I am a retired Unitarian Universalist minister, but my life has been much larger than that. In fact, I may have been brave enough to head toward ministry when I was about 50 years old, because it seemed like one way I could live up to the ideals my parents had taught me. They were big people. Mother played the piano at our little country church, Fairview, Disciples of Christ, about 35 miles down the road from here. Once our community out there was enlarged when a woman with actual opera experience moved in nearby and came to our church. And my mother, bless her heart, soon had that woman sharing her magnificent voice with us. And sure enough, one of the congregants came whispering to my mother, "Do you really think that woman should be singing here? You know, she smoked cigarettes." My blessed mother replied with no pause, "Then I shouldn't be playing the piano here because I eat too much." My father also was a large person. is a successful farmer. He taught us not only to care for the land, but to care for each other. Once, for instance, when our cousin's sheep broke through the fence and got mixed up with ours, my father acted, because that cousin and his wife at that time were suffering with the ongoing untreatable disease that was killing their 7-year-old son, and they had no money for medical exploration. So my father managed to find many, many more sheep on our cousin's side of the fence. More sheep for him. That was my father. These acts were tiny in the shadow of teachings from the likes of Jesus or Martin Luther King Jr., but my parents' acts were huge in my life, so large that I wanted more than what seemed the rigid teachings of that little country church. And I found that in my college experience, especially in poetry, like my beloved W.H. Auden saying, "You shall love your crooked neighbor with your crooked heart," which was possible. It all came together for me later and gave me more to bring to the table when I discovered the Universalist Church on Chicago's South Side. This was shortly before the Unitarian Universalist merger. That church was not far from where I lived, and it was powerful for me because it not only preached a message of black and white together, but it stood right there in a black and white neighborhood and raised money to send our minister off to Selma for the Selma March of 1965. So it was no wonder that I valued the words in that order of service, which proclaimed, "When we come to the end of all the light we have, and we step into the darkness, the unknown, we will find something solid we can stand upon, or I believe we will surely learn to fly." I didn't learn to fly, but through ministry and through my life, I've been very thankful that this Unitarian Universalist religion has given me something solid I can stand upon, solid like the teachings from my parents and the farmland that raised me.
Christians and pagans and Buddhists, oh my. I was born with the religious gene. I loved my Methodist Sunday school, church camp, and youth group, unlike my sister. My parents and extended family all agreed church was good. Life was good. Imagine my shock when at 16, my world crumbled in the wake of my parents' unexpected and shocking divorce. Personally, devastating. It was the worst thing at that point I'd ever known. It was easy to blame my cheating father and side heavily with my devout evangelical mother. I clung to the childhood safety net of religion. In college, I joined InterVarsity Christian Fellowship, a large on-campus student-led group. There, I lost myself in a sea of spiritual pursuits. Daily prayer meetings, small group Bible studies, chances to share my salvation story proudly, publicly. I was not shy. My senior year, I became president of this organization at the University of Illinois. I had attended the month-long leadership training, giving up my entire summer to pursue holiness and spiritual transformation. The only problem was, by then, I'd begun to question foundational tenets served up as absolute truth. During the camp experience, each Sunday we had a retreat of silence, a full day alone, designed to provide extended time with God. For an extrovert like me, this notion was absurd. How could being alone in nature for hours and hours and hours do anything? You weren't supposed to nap or bring a book, anything. Ironically, however, and I mean genuinely ironically, the days gave me my first glimpses of perspective. In those long hours of only my own conscience guiding me, I started to wonder, maybe my dad wasn't the devil I had assumed. Maybe there were two sides to the story. Maybe the God that I had known wasn't really involved in day-to-day life. Take the story of the girl in my cabin who had been brutally raped. I had never known anyone who had had such a terrible thing happen. Why did the leaders at this camp avoid addressing some of these complicated questions I was beginning to ask? Also that year, I student taught in an elementary school that would change my life. There I met older women who were social justice-minded old hippies. And honestly, they seemed more Christ-like than the Christians that I knew. They openly challenged ideas that I'd assumed were unquestionable. Stepping down as president of InterVarsity Christian Fellowship in the middle of the year, my doubts were serious, and I couldn't in good conscience stay by that time. I had taken shelter, I realized, in a system that had told me exactly how to spend my time, choose my friends, spend my money, what music to listen to, what books to read, directing every facet of my life. And I saw this for the laziness that it was. In my own personal crisis, I had reached for what was familiar, dependable, what seemed true and noble. And I had gone full tilt. It had been a very socially acceptable kind of addiction. But I didn't know who I was now without this framework, and it was going to be a lot of work to figure it out. For 10 years, I was angry, bitter, distrustful, and recovering. I was easily triggered and hurt by the ways I thought I'd been lied to, manipulated, and used. Though genuine in their beliefs, these people that I'd been involved with weren't critical thinkers, and most importantly, they weren't honest with themselves or others. But as I healed, 10 years is a long time, I started to look back to separate out the good from the bad. Were there pieces of my religious life that might still be of value? I really missed the community. I missed singing together. I missed higher principles to reach toward. I learned more about other religions, their similarities and differences. The pain of misogyny inherent in Judeo-Christian tradition led me to seek balance in the concept of the goddess. It delighted me to secretly begin to study several forms of paganism. In 1998, I did a solitary ceremony dedicating myself to eclectic paganism. It was a balm to my ragged soul. I never believed in the literal existence of gods or goddesses, but rather I found deep meaning in the symbolism, in the archetypes, in the roots, in nature and science of the times. The fear of losing the sunlight every winter, the threat that it may never return, was not an actual fear, but I could identify with dark days being the harbinger of challenging times ahead. I could see the wisdom in turning inward and hunkering down, allowing that necessary death that winter brings. Living in harmony with the cycles of the season in connection with the earth still gives my life a kind of grounding and assurance that my old Christian beliefs used to give me. Paganism, honestly, is a lot of work. Those of you who practice know. It's an active, expressive, participatory faith with lots of dancing and singing and fire jumping and the like. One time while I was carrying a drum and ritual items for an altar and matches and books and scarves and tablecloths, I remember joking to a friend, there was never this much stuff in Christianity. The energy and fervor that it takes to honor the wheel of the year eventually, I think, slowed down my commitment to the practice. 3 of my children were raised entirely in the pagan tradition and know it better than the traditional Christmas story. Discovering a local UU congregation would celebrate pagan activity, I was intrigued. I attended my first service on edge, prepared to be offended. At the first mention of the Bible, or words like God, Jesus, his son, I was out of there. But leaving that day, I was amazed. In good conscience, I could agree with everything I'd seen and heard. And to think my evangelical mother had warned me that UUs were a cult who believed in nothing. My expression of faith now leans toward slow change and inward work. Far from that 20-something person who abhorred the retreat of silence, I seek out quiet and solitude. Surprisingly, I comfortably meditate with Deborah Rogers and the others at the Awakening Heart Sangha on Monday nights. Eckhart Tolle, the books The Power of Now and A New Earth, have deepened my spirituality, steering me toward a higher sense of consciousness. Brené Brown, Rumi, my favorite Osho Zen tarot cards, will all send me a similar, singular kind of message at times that brings me a deep sense of interconnectedness. I marvel how our beliefs are many, yet we can be one. And I thank you for being a community that holds so many of our varied experiences.
Like many of you, I grew up in a small farming community. There were 3 churches in town, a Methodist church, a Baptist church, and an evangelical church. My mother was Presbyterian, my father was a Baptist when they moved there. Mother said she would go to the Baptist church if my father would go with her. However, he only had 1 day off each week, and he said he would rather go hunting and play golf on Sundays. So I became a Methodist. It always made me suspicious of anything called a true religion. I could have been a Southern Baptist or an evangelical. It was just a quirk of fate. I grew up attending Sunday school. My mother encouraged perfect attendance. Did any of you ever get those coveted little bars every year for perfect attendance? Well, I did. In fact, it was my mother was so zealous, we didn't even miss going to Sunday school on vacations. We would go on vacations. My parents would drop us off at a church. They would go have breakfast somewhere. We would go to the Sunday school. We'd get an old slip of paper and take it home. And so I had all these bars. I don't even know where they are anymore. I attended Bible school every summer, was in the youth group, the choir. In short, a typical Midwestern experience, small town experience. In fact, as like many people, in college I became disillusioned. And I couldn't figure out how a loving and personal God could allow the tragedies that existed in the world, like war, famine, floods, poverty, that affected so many innocent people. Had a lot of late night discussions over a lot of beer. And religion became irrelevant to my life at that point in time. Does that sound familiar? And then I got married and became a parent. What do we do now? We're not qualified to teach our children an ethical system. Does that sound familiar? How many of you came to church for the kids? A few of you, right. We tried a couple of liberal Protestant churches. It didn't fit. In 1966, some friends invited us to visit First Unitarian here in Des Moines. As they say on British TV, I was gobsmacked. It really opened my eyes. There was secular music, like keep your sunny side up. There was no praying, no reference to God, no reference to sin, and no guilt. However, there were some weird words to some familiar hymns. I heard a minister who wore the pain of our society on his sleeve. And I met a group of people who cared about things I cared about. This was during the Vietnam War and the Civil Rights era. And I was challenged every Sunday to consider my responsibilities to society and to act on them. I became very active on committees. I sang in the choir. I was on the church board. And I also began to consider my theological position. I became a non-theist, and then an agnostic, and then an atheist, and a few variations along the way. However, none of them really fit. In my view, all of them for me seemed very anti-something. I also learned about humanism at that time. One of the two founders of American humanism, Curtis Reese, had been a minister in this church. And for the first time, I found something positive and affirming that fit my worldview. So what is humanism? Well, it's been around since at least the 13th century. Here is a definition. Humanism is an approach to life based on reason and our common humanity, recognizing that moral values are properly founded on human nature and experience alone. Humanism is a positive attitude toward the world centered on human experience, thought, and hope. You may hear people talk about secular humanism, religious humanists. Well, what's the difference? Secular humanism, by the way, was very demonized by the religious right, especially in the 60s, and it still is. Secular humanism is the belief that humanity is capable of morality and self-fulfillment without belief in a God. Religious humanism is an integration of the humanist ethical philosophy with congregational but non-theistic rituals and community activity, which center on human needs, interests, and abilities. Thus today we have Unitarian Universalist humanism, we have humanistic Judaism, we have Christian humanism, we have humanistic Buddhism, we have Islamic humanism, etc., etc. Humanism has been adopted by groups in almost every major religion in the world. In my view, in humanism, there are no major differences in values, only in implementation. On my journey over the last 50 years, I've been a member of 4 different Unitarian Universalist congregations, served by 12 ministers with 12 different styles, 12 different messages, but in my view, all were humanists at heart. Over the last many years, I've done lots of searching, learning, and sharing of experiences. I've taught classes on humanism. I either have been in or facilitated many discussion groups. I'm a member of the National UU Humanist Group. How many of you knew there was a National UU Humanist Group? Not very many of you. There is. Go on the web, you'll see. I'm a member of the American Humanist Association, and I helped start the Iowa Humanist chapter of the American Humanist Association, which meets in our church. We currently have a semi-monthly book group and quarterly meetings. I continue to learn and explore. I'm a member of 4 different book groups, and all nonfiction, all based on looking at ethical issues. Basically, by nature, I'm a glass half-empty person at heart. I really am. I'm a pessimist. But humanism has helped me keep a positive faith in humanity while recognizing and accepting human weaknesses. In closing, I'd like to share a reading that has meant a lot to me over the years. I return to it frequently for sustenance. Will you join me in responsive reading? I don't know whether you have your hymnals or not. If you have them, it's number 657. If you don't have your hymnals, your part will show up here, I think. Okay, the responsive reading is titled, "It Matters What We Believe." Some beliefs are like walled gardens. They encourage exclusiveness and the feel of being especially privileged. Some beliefs are like shadows, clouding children's days with fears of unknown calamities. Some beliefs are divisive, separating the saved from the unsaved, friends from enemies. Some beliefs are like blinders, shutting off the power to choose one's own direction. Some beliefs weaken a person's selfhood. They blight the growth of resourcefulness. Some beliefs are rigid, like the body of death, impotent in a changing world.